A preacher and a lawyer. Can you be both of those? Oh my goodness. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, he is a man with a tremendous interest in the Old Testament, and especially the way archaeology confirms our faith. He and Jonathan Moore host many trips, and where are you all headed next?
We're headed to Greece and this fall to Turkey.
Wonderful. Well, Gary was with our teenagers this morning, and they enjoyed their time with him, and I know that you'll appreciate his overview of the 10 plagues.
Thank you, Greg. Really enjoyed being with the teenagers this morning. They are really impressive. They show a level of biblical understanding that is far beyond most of their peers, at least in my experience. And I don't have all the experience, but I've got enough to know the children, the young people who are here this morning are exceptional and impressive in a very good way. And you are to be complimented on that. And I am just can't sing their praises enough. We didn't have a lot of young people in there, so we were able to have a very interactive discussion. I did not have much to tell them that they didn't already know. And I had studied for it and they hadn't. And they could outline the book of Genesis, summarize the book of Exodus, understand that Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all covered the same time period. They were really, really good Bible students, and you're to be congratulated on that. But we have to really hurry because we have 10 plagues to cover this morning in a very brief period of time. This was 12 sermons at one point that have been combined down to one lecture. So we'll see how we do. But one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the 10 plagues is that the 10 plagues are not simply 10 miracles where God demonstrates his authority over the creation. Each plague is a demonstration of God's utter authority over the false gods of Egypt. And the Egyptians, through the centuries, had hundreds, and in some ways of counting easily, you can count thousands of gods. And their gods change during times. And so some of the things we're going to talk about this morning are pretty big generalizations. We're painting with a really broad brush and we're doing it really fast. But it's an accurate depiction, but there's a lot more detail that we're not going to go into. And there are other gods that we're not even going to talk about. But the first thing that I want you to know is that God is explaining who really is God. And so when God tells Moses and Aaron to bring these plagues onto Egypt, it's Exodus chapter 7, verse 5, God says, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring the sons of Israel out of their midst." At least 16 times in the book of Exodus, God says, so that they will know that I am the Lord. Interestingly, God says the same thing 64 times in the book of Ezekiel. That's not our topic this morning, but this seems like a pretty important point to God, that people know who really is God. And so each plague is designed to illustrate the point, who really is God and who really is not God. And then this afternoon, when we talk about the 10 commandments, we'll hear a very similar refrain. First plague, blood in the water. Exodus chapter 7, verse 20, that Moses and Aaron do exactly what God says, and he lifts up his staff and he strikes the water that's in the Nile while Pharaoh and all of Pharaoh's servants are standing there. The water in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died. The Nile became foul. If you pull up Google Maps or Google Earth and you look at Egypt and you get way broader than a city where you see the whole country, what you'll see is you'll see this really big brown strip with this green line running through it. That green line is the Nile Delta, or the Nile Valley, that runs from Upper Egypt, which is in the south, to Lower Egypt, which is in the north at the Mediterranean Sea. This is right in the middle at Luxor, formerly called Thebes. Sometimes when the Bible talks about Thebes, it's talking about what we now call Luxor, but it's right in the middle of Egypt. But you can see this irrigation and this agriculture that is built on the Nile. You come forward to the Grecian period, to the Roman Empire. A lot of the Roman Empire's grain comes from Egypt, but it's not because of the rain and fertility of Egypt. It's because of the fertility and the water of the Nile. And so for 4,000 years, Egypt has been super proud of the Nile. The Nile makes Egypt different from any other country that you can find in a long ways from Egypt, because of this amazing water source that, before the British came in and built dams, used to flood every year, recycle the soil, recycle the fertility. Everything in Egypt flowed from the Nile and through the Nile. And so the first plague turned the Nile to blood, which kills everything. Well, one of Egypt's favorite gods is a god called Hapi, or Happy. He is the god of the Nile. And if you look here, I'm going to show you another more modern picture, but you see this is an ancient tomb from the 18th dynasty, where the king is sitting on the throne, but his throne is sitting on this god Hapi. And this god Hapi represents the Nile. This is a more modern representation of it, but he's on two sides. He has a big belly for fatness. He has breasts for feeding, for wealth. He has a lotus plant on the left. He has a papyrus plant on the right. They're tying together Upper and Lower Egypt. He is the personification, the deification of the Nile River. And so they've taken the Nile and they have turned him into a god and worshiped it. That's what the Egyptians are doing. And so the first plague makes the Nile a source of death, a source of blood, takes it all away. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. The Egyptians had nothing to be proud about. They should have given glory to the maker of the Nile. They should have given glory to the designer of agriculture and the giver of life, instead of giving it to the Nile. A lesson they should have learned with the first plague. They didn't, and so they got another plague. The second plague is frogs everywhere. Frogs in the house. Exodus chapter 8, verse 3, the promise is the Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your house, into your bedroom, and on your bed, and into the houses of your servants, and on your people, and into your ovens, and into your kneading bowls. The frogs are going to be everywhere. Why would he choose frogs? Well, frogs are a symbol of the health of the Nile River. Right? When the Nile is healthy, there are lots of frogs. And so they have taken frogs and they have deified frogs into the goddess Heket. Heket is the goddess of children, the goddess of childbirth. If you wanted to get pregnant and you were not getting pregnant in a timely way, as an Egyptian, you might go to a temple and offer a sacrifice to the goddess Heket. And so frogs are treated as special. They don't kill frogs. They don't eat frogs. They don't step on frogs. And so God fills their houses with frogs. They can't lay on their bed without laying on a bed of frogs. They can't walk to the next room without walking on frogs. This thing they've been worshiping, God turns into a curse. Frogs are not a source of fertility. They don't bring children. They became a stench and a horror. Psalm 68, verse 5, talking about God, a father of the fatherless and a judge for the widows is God in his holy habitation. God makes a home for the lonely. He leads out the prisoners into prosperity. Only the rebellious dwell in a parched land. God is the source of children. God is the answer to loneliness and emptiness. A lesson they should have learned with the second plague. They didn't, and so they got a third plague. The third plague is dust into gnats. Exodus chapter 8, verse 17, Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats through all the land of Egypt. So you just imagine all of the dust, all of the particles of dirt, all of the dust on your shoes. Everything becomes a gnat. Everything becomes these little bugs. And the word translated in the English gnat comes from the Hebrew word, which doesn't mean a particular bug. It actually means annoying insect. It's a broader term than one particular kind of insect. And so it may have been multiple kinds of insects. It may have been mosquitoes. It may have been ticks. It may have been lice. You get the picture, right? So the Egyptians, guess what? Worship the earth. They worship the dirt. They worship the ground. We'll look at the thing stretched out above in a few minutes. But if you look at this person stretched out on the bottom of this painting that came from this tomb, this is a depiction of the god Geb, sometimes called Keb, different English spellings for this same god. But this is the god of the ground. And so he's always pictured as covered with green leaves to illustrate fertility. He is the source of food. He is the source of life. And so God takes the dust and he turns it into annoyance. These annoying things are things, these little bugs are a lot like worry. The Egyptians thought that the source of their freedom from worry or anxiety was the fertility of their soil as fed by the Nile, right? So their strength, their freedom from worry, their freedom from fear is because their land is so productive and they have plenty of food. And God makes the land annoying, something really to worry about. Matthew chapter 6, verse 32, talking about food, talking about clothing, what they will eat, what they will drink, what they will wear for clothing. Jesus says the Gentiles eagerly seek after all these things. For your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. He knows you need food. He knows you need the land to be productive. He knows you need clothes to wear. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Your relationship with God, your status before God, whether God is taking care of you and taking care of your eternity, whether or not you are going to spend eternity with God, that should be first. Not how productive your land is, not how much money, not how much wealth you have. And that was illustrated by the annoying insects in the fourth plague, the third plague. The fourth plague, insects again, swarms of insects this time. Exodus chapter 8, verses 21 and 22. For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and on your people and into your houses. And the houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they dwell. But on that day, I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people are living, so that no swarms of flies will be there, in order that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. So God now draws a distinction. He has illustrated his power in taking the things that really surround the Nile and the Nile feeds, turning it on their head, making it source of annoyance and death. But now he draws a distinction between, between the Israelites and the Egyptians. There's no question whether this is a divine thing. There's no rational approach that says this is anything other than a powerful being causing these things to happen. And he emphasizes again, so that you will know that I'm here. You will know that I am God and that I am in your midst. Now, the word translated fly here could mean, the Septuagint translates it dog fly, or what we would call a dog fly. In Tennessee, we call them horse flies. I had always heard the term gadfly, but I never knew what it was until I started studying this. Well, a gadfly, a dog fly, a horse fly, and a stable fly are all the same or almost the same. There's no history of the Egyptians worshiping the horsefly, or whatever word they use in Ohio for horsefly, which we Tennessee's horsefly. But that may be a misunderstanding when you come to the 2nd century BC, when the Septuagint is translated, of what the word originally meant when Moses wrote it down. And there is an animal that looks a lot like a horsefly or a stable fly, a dog fly, and it is a scarab beetle. And a scarab beetle has a lot in common with a fly and with a horsefly. They're both born frequently in excrement. Flies are often born in the excrement of animals, cows, horses. That's why you find them around horses. That's why you find them in stables, horse stables, and things of that nature. Scarab beetle doesn't fly, but what it does, it's also called the dung beetle. The dung beetle takes the dung in which it's born and it rolls it up into a ball and then buries it in the ground, lays its eggs in it, and then its eggs are born again. And so it rolls it around and digs a hole in the ground and puts it in the ground. They're actually really good for soil regeneration, but it's because they're working with excrement all the time. The Egyptians worshipped the dung beetle, the scarab beetle. This is the god Khepri. And you can see sometimes he's depicted just as a beetle, as a scarab beetle. Sometimes he's depicted as a man with a scarab beetle head. But Khepri supposedly rolled the sun up out of the underworld every morning so that it could be taken across the sky by the god Ra. So that's Egyptian mythology. Like the scarab beetle rolls balls up out of the earth, they thought that this god Khepri, or didn't think but said, this god Khepri makes the sun come up every morning. And so we saw pictures of this when we were in Egypt with the Hayneses and with the Tidwells a little over a year ago. You go into these museums and you see these amulets of scarab beetles everywhere. Well, that's why, because they worship a god that looks like and is meant to depict a dung beetle. You talk about prioritizing the wrong thing. You talk about putting value in something that is actually disgusting and mostly powerless. Well, the Egyptians were as good at it as we are, though we're probably not much better at it or about it than they were. Philippians chapter 3, verse 7, Paul says, whatever things were gained to me, those I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ. More than that, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, that I may gain Christ and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith. The Egyptians worshiped the dung beetle, but human beings worship some pretty disgusting things. I don't know if y'all know this, but our world has a huge problem with pornography. Our congregations have a huge problem with pornography. Preachers have a huge problem with pornography. It's disgusting. It's wrong. Often involves slavery and human trafficking and the pollution, the defilement of the human body. Worse than a dung beetle. But Americans worship that. But everything that we might worship, money, power, career, popularity, pleasure, recreation, athletic prowess, and the list could go on and on. Or for Paul, distinction in Judaism, position and influence in religion. Rubbish. Rubbish. The only thing that matters is gaining Christ, knowing Christ, having the faith that comes from God through Christ. That's all there is. Putting anything else in front of it is putting garbage at the top. The fifth plague, pestilence on livestock. Up until this point, he's hurt them agriculturally with the turning of the Nile to blood. And these plagues probably lasted, there's different views on how long they lasted. My view is they probably lasted anywhere from 9 to 18 months. It probably went through at least a couple of different seasons, maybe 5 or 6 seasons. They're not day after day, right? And it takes a long time to recover from what happens. But he has hit the Nile. He has brought swarms of insects and annoying insects and things of this nature. But now he is taking something that lasts much longer. Exodus chapter 9, verse 2. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will come with a very severe pestilence on your livestock which are in the field, on the horses, on the donkeys, on the camels, on the herds, and on the flocks. Well, let me tell you something. If you know anything about horses, if you know anything about cattle, and it's even worse with camels, and in the desert, in Egypt, camels were really important. A donkey, when we were in Egypt in 2023, we saw a lot of carts being pulled by donkeys in 2023. Really important. You lose a donkey, it takes years to recover. To get another donkey, to let it grow, to train it, to do the work you need it to do. It takes at least a year just to get another cow from the cows that you have. Now, sheep and goats are quicker than that. Chickens much quicker than that. But these larger animals, it's a much bigger loss to lose one animal. And now he really starts to hit it where it hurts. Really starts to hit him in the pocketbook. Why would he choose these animals, and particularly the herds or the cows? This is a picture of the queen. Jonathan Moore posits, and I think he's got a pretty good argument, that the daughter of Pharaoh who pulled Moses out of the reeds of the Nile is a woman named Hatshepsut, who later becomes sort of co-regent with her brother who was the Pharaoh. Now, it's a really good argument that it was either her or one of her sisters, but it could have been her. But this is a scene from her tomb, and this is her drinking from the cow, which is a representative of the goddess Hathor. Hathor is the goddess of fertility, but really the goddess of plenty, the goddess of a lot, and Hathor is worshipped by celebration, by parties, by consumption, by alcohol, and by rampant sexual promiscuity, which is typical of most pagan religion. It is typical of the pagan religion that Joshua and the Israelites encounter when they come into the Canaanites, the land of the Perizzites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Amorites, right? And the way they worshiped the gods of the Levant up there in Israel, Lebanon and Syria, same kind of practices. But in Egypt, it's the goddess Hathor, and she's worshipped with drinking parties. The Greeks are doing the same thing with their gods, right? And they picture it on the tomb. But then they also worship another god called the Apis bull. The Apis bull is a living bull that they keep at a temple in Egypt, and he is a representative of the god Ptah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but you're never going to teach a southerner like me to say it the way an Egyptian does, but it's close. Ptah. Ptah is a creator god. He's sort of the father of everything. But the way they did it with this Apis bull, which was a representative or a representation of the god Ptah, is they would have these huge festivals with all of the drinking and the carousing and the promiscuity, and they would parade him around the city or around the temple complex or whatever the case may be in symbolic fertilization of everything, of the whole land. And so this bull is really a symbol of sexual fertility and spreading of seed. That's what their worship consisted of. This is a mummy that we have here in the United States at the Smithsonian Institute. After this bull would die, they would mummify it. And they've been preserved and even brought for Americans to look at in our own museums. These artifacts of false worship upon whom God brought the plagues. Modern day, it's interesting. It's human civilization. It's social study, but to God, it's profane. It's evil. It's the worship of the wrong thing, and in many ways, the deification of sexual immorality. James chapter 4, verse 1, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? Be careful about your pleasures. Be careful about the source of your pleasures, and make sure that they are brought into subjection to your commitment to your Creator, to your Savior, because those pleasures, those desires, are an easy way for you to be led away from the true source of life and meaning. The sixth plague, ashes into boils. This is a different one. This is an interesting one. Exodus chapter 9, verse 10, they took soot from a kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it toward the sky, and it became boils breaking out with sores on man and beast. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. So until this time, right, when Moses throws his staff down, it becomes a serpent. The magicians do the same thing. When Moses turns the water into blood, the magicians do the same thing. Well, now we have an end to the magicians. This is the last time the magicians are mentioned in the book of Exodus. They're not there anymore. God brings the boils. And it's interesting that he brings the boils on the Egyptians from the soot of a kiln, because the Egyptians are most famous for the pyramids. The Egyptians worshipped a deity called Imhotep, and this is a statue of Imhotep with a scroll. He is so-called the god of knowledge, the god of healing, the god of science. But a healer or a scientist in ancient Egypt would be called a magician. They were indistinguishable. They were the same thing in that ancient world. But Imhotep started out as an actual person. He was an actual really smart guy. He was apparently a pretty good scientist, figured out some things about medicine. He was also a master architect and probably designed the oldest existing pyramid, the step pyramid, the pyramid of Djoser in Egypt. And it started out with steps, and then later they figured out how to make the sides smooth. So Imhotep is a smart guy, but they take a smart guy and they deify him and turn him into what they call a god. And they start to worship him. They also have the god of Thoth. And a lot of the Egyptian pharaohs are named for Thoth. And so you might see King Tut. It's a form of the word Thoth. It's just different pronunciations, different spellings. Thutmose the first, Thutmose the second, Thutmose the third. All based on the god Thoth as part of their name. Thoth is also the so-called god of writing, of wisdom, magic, and the moon. And so what does God do? He brings from the making of the bricks, the kilns where they make the bricks, that the magicians specialize in, building and things like this, their science. And he takes that soot and destroys their magicians, exposes them as powerless, shows their God to be powerless. Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, not of Imhotep, not of Einstein, not of Hawking, not of Jobs, not of Musk. The heavens are telling of the glory of God. Their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. Worship the one who really did it, the one who really does it. The seventh plague, hail, thunder, and lightning. We looked at this picture earlier with the god of the ground, which is the god they worshipped as Geb. And then you have the god of the sky, which is the goddess Nut. And Nut is order. She is the one who protects. The weather in Egypt is amazingly calm. They get almost no rain. They get like 2 inches of rain a year. I mean, it's like practically nothing. It was really interesting. One of the days that we were there, we were on the banks of the Red Sea, and it rained just a little bit. And everybody was like, they were like super excited because it rained less than a tenth. I mean, way less than a tenth. Not really enough to knock down all the dust, but it just never rains. But it's always calm. There's seldom a cloud. And so they give credit for that to Nut. And they say she is the one that provides order. She is the one that keeps away the chaos, keeps away all of the bad things that come in the weather. And so what does God do? He brings a storm of hail and lightning and thunder that lasts for days. Luke chapter 9, verse 23, he was saying to them all, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. Do you see what Jesus says here? Jesus says that a lot of people think they can keep chaos out of their life. A lot of people think that they can build their lives, they can get enough money, they can amass enough guns, they can amass the best health care, they can have the best army, the best military, the best president, the best generals, the best whatever. And they're never going to have a problem. They're never going to have to worry. There's not going to be any disorder. There's not going to be any chaos. If we can just control this one last thing, right? If we can just get this under control, then we're going to be safe. Jesus says that following him requires a cross. Jesus says that you can't hunker down and build your bunker. You have to pick up your cross, You have to endure difficulty, you have to endure hardship, and you have to walk the road that follows his footsteps. There is disorder, there is chaos, there is hardship in this world, and God's people go through it because God brings us through it. He does not promise a protection from it. The Egyptians thought they were promised protection from it. God showed them that was clearly untrue. Eighth plague, probably the second most famous plague, right? The one that still gets mentioned maybe most of all today, especially in the news. Every year, every several months, I'll see a headline in the news, a plague of locusts strikes Syria, plague of locusts strikes Afghanistan, right? And they refer back to the plague of locusts. And it is the eighth plague. And so you've had all of these things. You've had the pestilence on the livestock. You've had the blood in the Nile. You've had the hail that killed a lot of the animals. You have all of these different things, the flies and the gnats and the lice that has devastated the agriculture. And then Exodus chapter 10, verse 13. So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord directed an east wind on the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. What do you think the Egyptians worshipped that might have been attacked in this plague? It's not locusts. They didn't worship locusts. They worshiped the wind. You may have heard of the goddess Isis. Isis, it was sort of adopted into Greek religion, Greek paganism, in the form of Aphrodite. There are literally people in 2025 in the United States and across the world who worship Isis today. Isis is depicted with her wings outstretched because Isis is the controller of the wind. She is the one that brings the good things that come on the wind. She is the one that brings the air. And so she's always shown with these wings. And God uses the wind to bring devastation. The locusts ate everything. They didn't leave anything for man or beast to eat. Utter destruction of their agriculture that grew out of the Nile, which is their way of life. It has just been destroyed over and over and over again by all of the things from the Nile itself, the dust of the ground, the sky itself, the hail, the weather, everything that they thought was protection became their attacker. And the wind is no exception. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. Godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering with these, we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Isis was the goddess of wealth. She was the goddess of plenty, the goddess of ease. God teaches you can only rely on Him, but you need to be content with enough. The always having more, the always being discontent with what He's decided to give you leads to destruction. It leads you down this wrong path that He's illustrated over and over again. The ninth plague, darkness. It's interesting how the ninth plague is described. Exodus chapter 10, verse 22. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and there was thick darkness. Interesting term. Thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. But all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. Think about this. It's dark, right? No sun at all. Why can't you light a fire? Why can't you light a lamp or light a torch and go out and conduct business, or, go to the well and get water, or whatever it is that you need to do? There's no sun, but why not light? The Bible doesn't really tell us. This is basically the information we get. So anything beyond this is going to be speculation, but some people have speculated. And I want to share a little bit of speculation from a really respected scholar named Alfred Edersheim. Alfred Edersheim posits that it might have been something like a dust storm. And here's what he says in a dust storm. The air, charged with electricity, draws up the fine dust and the coarser particles of sand till the light of the sun is hid. The heavens are covered as with a thick veil, and darkness deepens into such night that even artificial light is of no avail. And the floating dust and sand enter every apartment, pervade every pore, find their way even through closed windows and doors. And so the idea is, in this kind of sandstorm, you could have a candle or a lamp and hold it in your hand and not be able to see it because of the thickness of dust between you and the source of light. Thick darkness. Ra. Ra is the god that people often know about, the Egyptian god. This is two different depictions of Ra. He's always depicted with a falcon head. His son is the eye of the falcon. But this is Amun-Ra, king of the gods, Ra-Harakti, which is just a different version of him. But Ra is the god of the sun. He is the one that takes the sun across the sky. He is the chief of the gods, the number one god, the head god, at least for a lot of Egyptian history. And these things, they make it up for themselves, so it changes as they want it to. But this is the generalization that God is showing his absolute powerlessness to take the sun across the sky. God brings in darkness. Nobody can do anything. Nobody can go anywhere. This is a picture of him in his boat where he takes the sun across the sky. James 1, verse 17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. In the beginning, God is light. In Christ, in him there was light, and light was the light, in him was life, life was the light of men. God is the Father of lights, not Ra. He demonstrated that very powerfully. Finally, plague 10, the death of the firstborn. Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. This plague was a plague on Pharaoh and the idea of Pharaoh. But notice this. Here's where it tells us that these judgments of the 10 plagues are not just judgments on the Pharaoh and not just judgments on the Egyptians, but judgments on all the gods of the Egyptians. And the 10th plague is no less than that. This is a judgment scene from a compilation that they found in a tomb. It's from what's called the Book of the Dead, where it depicts Egyptian funeral rites and their understanding of what happens in the afterlife. And what you see here is you have I forgot which god has a coyote head, but he brings the dead into the realm of the dead. And there in the middle, you have the scales where they're weighing the heart of the dead person in the scales against a feather. And then he's taken to Osiris over to the right. And so we will go over here to Osiris to the right, and he is the king of the dead, the king of the gods, but he is also the father of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the earthly manifestation of Osiris, and the son of Pharaoh is the manifestation of Osiris's son, Horus. The eye of Horus up there in the top left. That eye is really typical in Egyptian depictions, but it's the eye of Horus which depicts the son of Pharaoh. The Egyptians worship Pharaoh, call him a god, say he becomes Osiris when he dies, and his son is Horus, who becomes Pharaoh when the other Pharaoh dies. But there is in Egypt a worship of youth, a worship of the new, a worship of the young. And so in Egypt and in all these museums, you see amazing cosmetics. When you look at their artwork, they depict their divine beings, their godlike figures with makeup, with cosmetics. And it's not just about beauty, it's about youth. Does that sound familiar? Do you think it's hard to go into our culture today and find people who don't have any concern over what anybody over the age of 35 thinks or experienced or knows? Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. He who loves mother or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Brothers and sisters, some people are worshiping their children. Some people are worshiping the hope that their children will get a college scholarship in athletics or academics or band or gymnastics or video games. And they take them away from church and they take them away from spiritual activities so that they can learn more about how to swing a bat or kick a ball or program a computer. They're worshiping their children. They're teaching their children to worship themselves, and everybody's forgetting God. Jesus said, if you do that, you're not worthy of me. You're not going to have any place with me. John chapter 5, verse 21, just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he wishes. You want your children to have life? Bring them to Jesus. Verse 25, an hour's coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Not because of Osiris. Not Osiris's judgment of your life when you die. Jesus. That's the one you should be paying attention to. The plagues are a round rebuke on the gods of Egypt, and the lessons for the Egyptians 3,500 years ago resound through history and teach us a lot today. Thank you for your attention.